Hello again, this is Adam, and I am here for another video on my ranking of my favorite 15 favorite Agatha Christie novels. Today we're up to number 13, and today we will have for the first time, but not the last time, a Miss Marple Agatha Christie novel. So today's um, novel that we're discussing is called The Body in the Library. This novel comes pretty early in the list of Miss Marple novels. Um, Before this time period, Miss Marple was introduced in a 1930 novel called A Murder at the Vicarage. And then a few years later, after that, Agatha Christie wrote a short story collection of Miss Marple books called the Tuesday Murder Club. In America, it's collected under a different title, just the collected stories, short stories of Miss Marple. But this is only the third appearance of Miss Marple and only the second full-length novel that we see Miss Marple as a character, as the main detective in an Agatha Christie book. This is a story that takes place shortly before World War II. This book was written in 1942, but the setting is a couple of years before this. You don't get too many hints about there being a war or trouble brewing in England because of the international crisis that's going on the continent. That doesn't take place. This is a very free and easy and lighthearted book where people don't have too many political concerns to focus on in the story. This is a time period in Agatha Christie's career where she's really fertile. She's writing a lot of books and a lot of really great books, to be honest with you. World War II seems to be a very productive time for her. She's recently written And Then There Were None. Sad Cypress came a few years before this one. Right after this one, she wrote N and M, which is a Tommy and Tuppence book. She wrote another book called Evil Under the Sun, which was really a great book. Towards Zero came out during the war years. 1-2 Buckle My Shoe came out during the war years. So it's a really productive time for Agatha Christie, despite all that's going on in Great Britain at the time. So The Body in the Library, being a Miss Marple book, is a little bit of a cliche. The idea that if you know your murder mysteries really well, or if you have a background in reading a lot of murder mysteries, the idea that a body has been discovered in the library sets off a whole bunch of cliches. And Agatha Christie cleverly thought that she would kind of play with that. In the preface to her book, she talks about how she wanted to have the setting be a very, very ordinary library, nothing special about the library. The library in question is in Gossington Hall, which is owned by the Bantry family. The Bantrys are Colonel Bantry and Dolly Bantry, and they are people who are actually friends of Miss Marple's, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But then she didn't want the body that was discovered to be a usual body. She wanted the body in the story, or the body that's discovered in the story, to have a sensational effect on the town that it's discovered in. The setting is St. Mary Mead, which is a fictitious town that Agatha Christie has Miss Marple. That's where Miss Marple lives. And again, when we met her before previously in A Murder at the Vicarage, that was also set in St. Mary Mead. So it's just a fictitious, quaint, cozy little English town. Provides a great setting for the story of the body in the library. Some of the story of the body in the library also takes place in a nearby resort town that's not too far away from St. Mary Mead, and that is called, and again, it's another fictitious town, and it is called Danemouth. And there's a hotel in Danemouth, which is called the Majestic Hotel, where a lot of the story takes place there. Again, a fictitious setting. So the body that is discovered in the library is discovered by the servants of the Bantry family, and they wake up Dolly Bantry and her husband, Colonel Bantry, and it's hard to believe at first that this has happened. Who is this body, and how did it get into their library? Dolly thinks this is kind of fun. It's kind of exciting to have some notoriety and people talking about you. So she enlists her friend Jane Marple because she knows that Jane is very clever and she's good at figuring out who has killed bodies. So she knows Jane is very clever, and so she brings Jane in and asks that Jane will help discover who this body in the library is. And then, of course, the police are alerted and the police do their investigations. We see some of the same police detectives that were in A Murder at the Vicarage. We're reunited with Inspector Slack, who's a little bit rude and dismissive of other people. And we also see Colonel Melchett. He shows up again. And Colonel Melchett is kind of a little bit of he's an upper class detective. And so he's kind of set in his ways. He's traditional. We have a new detective in this story called Superintendent Turner, who's a little bit more thoughtful of other people's skills, and he can help. He understands that they're going to need outside help, not just the police. They can't solve this one on their own. So he's turning to the people in the village to, whatever way they can help. He's grateful to have their help. So there's a lot of detectives and police in this story. Some of the main characters in the story that you want to know about, it's not too long until we're introduced to a man called Basil Blake, and he's a young man who has a rather poor reputation in the town, and so some of the suspicion of being a murderer immediately falls on him. He's working in the film industry, and he stays up late and has many parties, and he's a little bit dismissive of the older generations. And in fact, it comes out pretty early in the story that he doesn't like Colonel Bantry. They seem to have a little bit of a dispute amongst themselves, and I want to read you just a little bit of section of this story so you can kind of get some ideas about kind of how Agatha Christie writes the story. And so this is when the police go over to talk to Basil Blake, because again, he's one of the early suspects. He's the most likely person who might have, since he works in the film industry, obviously his morals are low, and so he could certainly be a murderer. Are you Mr. Basil Blake? Of course I am. I should be glad to have a few words with you, if I may, Mr. Blake. Who are you? I'm Colonel Melchett, the chief constable of the county, Mr. Blake said insolently. You don't say so. How amusing. And Colonel Melchett, following the other end, understood what Colonel Bantry's reactions had been. The toe of his own boot itched. Containing himself, however, he said with an attempt to speak pleasantly, You're an early riser, Mr. Blake. Not at all. I haven't been to bed yet. Indeed. But I don't suppose you've come here to inquire into my hours of bed going, or if you have, it's rather a waste of the county's time and money. What does he want to speak to me about? Colonel Melchett cleared his throat. I understand, Mr. Blake, that last weekend you had a visitor, a fair-haired young lady. Basil Blake stared, threw back his head, and roared with laughter. Have the old cats been onto you from the village? About my morals? Damn it all, morals aren't a police matter. You know that. As you say, said Melchett dryly, your morals are no concern of mine. I have come to you because the body of a fair-haired young woman of slightly, exotic appearance has been found. Murdered. Struth, Blake stared at him. Where? In the library at Gossington Hall. At Gossington? At old Bantry's, I say. That's pretty rich. Old Bantry, the dirty old man. Colonel Melchett went very red in the face. He said sharply, through the renewed mirth of the young man opposite him, kindly control your tongue, sir. I came to ask you if you can throw any light on this business. You've come around to ask me if I've missed a blonde, is that it? Why should hello, what's this? A car had drawn up outside him with a scream of brakes. Out of it tumbled a young woman dressed in flapping black and white pajamas. She had scarlet lips, blackened eyelashes, and a platinum blonde head. She strode up to the door, flung it open, and exclaimed angrily, Why did you run out on me, you brute? Basil Blake had risen. So there you are. Why shouldn't I leave you? I told you to clear out, and you wouldn't. Why the hell should I? Because you told me to. I was enjoying myself. Yes, with that filthy brute Rosenberg. You know what he's like. You were jealous, that's all. So in this story, at the exchange at the end comes with Basil and his girlfriend, Dinah Lee. And so the murdered person, the body in the library, is a platinum blonde, and Dinah Lee is also a platinum blonde. But as you can see from the reading, she's very much alive. And so they eventually find out that the platinum blonde is a woman named Ruby Keene, and she is a dancer who works at the Majestic Hotel that I mentioned earlier in the video, the Majestic Hotel over at Danemouth. And Ruby Keene has an interesting backstory. Her body was identified by her cousin, Josie Turner. Josie also works at the Majestic Hotel in Danemouth. Josie is a person who is a dancer, And so she's a dance partner for any men who come to the hotel who want to dance who don't have a partner. But she also arranges bridge games for people who would be interested in playing bridge. So Josie is a hotel employee, and she actually recommended her cousin Ruby Keene to be able to fill in for her as a dancer because Josie injured herself. And so Ruby took that spot and filled that spot. And so Josie is the one that comes over to Gossington Hall, where the Bantrys live, and identifies that the body is her cousin, in fact, Ruby Keene. So we want to talk a little bit about Ruby's backstory, as it helps us to understand the novel a little bit better. Ruby has become very friendly at the hotel with a man who stays at the hotel and who's stayed there for a long time, and his name is Conway Jefferson. And Conway is a very wealthy man. Now, Conway is very generous with his wealth. In fact, he had a very loving family. So many years ago, Conway, his wife Margaret, and then they had two children. They had a daughter named Adelaide, and they also had a son named excuse me. So they had a son named Frank. Frank Jefferson was the oldest son of Conway and Margaret Jefferson, and then they had a daughter, and the daughter's name was Rosamond. And so each of their kids gets married. Frank marries a woman called Adelaide. Adelaide had been previously married, and her husband died, but not before they had a son, and the son's name was Peter Carmody. And then Conway and Margaret's daughter Rosamond had married a man called Mark Gaskell. And so the family was really happy, and they were, very loving family. Everybody was getting along very, very well. And then the family decided to go on a plane flight, and in the plane crash, the family was killed. Except for Conway. Conway lost his wife Margaret. He lost his son Frank, and he lost his daughter Rosamond. They died in the plane crash. Conway was badly injured, and so he's in a wheelchair, and he's been crippled. So this has been 8 years have passed since this plane accident, and in the intervening time, Conway has just been living with his daughter-in-law Adelaide and his son-in-law Mark, and they've been kind of just helping each other through the grieving process of having lost loved ones. And like I said, 8 years have passed. Now, Conway was a very generous person with his money. He gave money to his son's family and his daughter's family so they could live happily ever after. But as it turns out in the story, we find out that even with the money that Conway gave them, the younger generation doesn't have much money left. As it turns out, Frank was poor at business, and so his investments didn't turn out very well, and so Frank didn't really provide very well for his wife Adelaide. In fact, Adelaide, in the intervening 8 years, she's an attractive lady. She would like to get remarried. She has a couple of suitors, people who have their eye on her. One of them is there's a tennis pro at the hotel. His name is Raymond Starr, and he has an interest in Adelaide. But then there was also a man named Hugo McLean, who is also interested in getting to know Adelaide very, very much better. So Adelaide would like to remarry and get on with her life, but she feels like maybe because Conway is wanting to cling to his daughter-in-law and his son-in-law as the only direct relations or remembrance to his family that died in the car crash. So Adelaide's a little bit nervous about getting remarried. And then Mark, he got his money from Rosamond, who was Conway's daughter, but Mark was kind of a gambler by nature, and so he kind of gambled the inheritance from the family away. So Mark doesn't even have any real money left over either. So they're kind of relying on Conway Jefferson to continue to give them money. So, but interestingly, in the story, Conway, in a short time, gets very attached to Ruby Keene. They form a very close relationship. They become, even though there's a huge age difference, Conway sees himself as being more like a father figure to Ruby because Ruby doesn't have any family other than Josie of her own, and so Conway grows very close to Ruby Keene. In fact, he's let his lawyers know, and he's let the family know that he's going to remake a new will, and he's going to leave everything to Ruby Keene. Now, as you can see, since she's the one who ends up being murdered, you can see that obviously with Ruby's murder, that the son-in-law and the daughter-in-law of Conway Jefferson, Adelaide and Mark, both have really good reasons to want Ruby out of the picture. And so obviously there are murder suspects as well. So the night that Ruby went missing, the last person that she was seen with was a man named George Bartlett. She was dancing with George Bartlett at the hotel before she disappeared. So George Bartlett is another person who is a murder suspect also. And George's car has gone missing as well. To further complicate matters, there's this girl named Pamela Reeves, who is also gone missing, and she was known to have been talking to Basil Blake, who we talked about before, the person who is the film star. And so, excuse me, not the film star, but worked in the film industry. So Basil Blake, that's one of the reasons that he might be a murder suspect too. So in fact, we will find out as we go into a little bit further into the story. Pamela Reeves herself turns up murdered, so we have two dead bodies in this story. In terms of Agatha Christie stories, it's got the classic Agatha Christie surprise twist at the end that you didn't see coming that makes the story all of a sudden just that much more interesting. The characters, I think, are pretty interesting. I think the story is really indicative of what Agatha Christie wanted to write at this time. Just a fun murder mystery with lots of interesting characters and a great twist at the end. It just is a really, really wonderful story. And it's pretty short. It's one of her shorter detective novels, so it won't take you more than 2 days probably to read. It's just very light and it's very breezy. It's interesting that this is a Marple novel. Her famous detective, of course, that she'd been writing a lot of books about before was Poirot, Hercule Poirot, who we haven't mentioned him yet in the rankings, but we will, of course. This is a case that is especially keen to Miss Marple because one of the things that she notices when she goes to see Ruby Keane's body in the library, she says there's just something that's not right about her dress. And the little clue has something to do with her fingernails as well. And so something's just amiss. And it takes a Miss Marple to notice that. Not that Poirot wouldn't have noticed that, but it makes much more sense that Miss Marple would notice something like that. And when you're talking about a murder mystery set in a small English village, it's just a perfect setting for a typical Miss Marple murder mystery. There are a couple of movie versions of this I'll mention in closing here. I have seen the Joan Hickson one that came out, I think, in the 80s. I have not seen the Geraldine McEwen one that has come out more recently. One of the things I like about the movie adaptations is they don't change the book too much. I'm not really a huge fan when they change a lot of the storyline to make the movie versions. Sometimes they do it well, but more often than not, I think it's a little bit of a hubris to think that these film writers can come up with a better plot than Agatha Christie did. So I prefer it if it just stays pretty close to the book, with a few slight alterations, sometimes being an improvement. But this is The Body in the Library. Again, it's a really, really good one, and only take a couple of days to read, and I think you'll really enjoy it. I did not solve the murder in this one. Maybe you will, but I did not see this one coming. Okay, so we'll see what are the ones that come up a little bit higher in our ranking than A Body in the Library. But coming in at number 12, Miss Marple's Body in the Library. Have a good day. See you soon.